Okay, well, it is now 6 p.m., so I'll go ahead start introductions. Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for attending. Welcome to the State of the Basin webinar. We are so excited to share with you all the update on the hydrology of the region. I'm Holly Fisher. I'm the Restoration Program Manager at the Amargosa Conservancy, and the State of the Basin report is brought to you by Roux, who's amazing, and they are great collaboratives on this effort, and the Wildlife Conservation Board grant that's helping fund a lot of these monitoring and conservation efforts that we do in the region, which is really great. Thank you both to Andy Zdon and Rachel Maxwell for putting this all together, taking the time out of your day to share with us. I'm super excited to learn all that will be discussed today. And with that, I'll pass it on to y'all.
Hi, everybody. Really pleased to be here to present the State of the Basin report under the Wildlife Conservation Board grant. We're going to get to prepare two of these. This one was to essentially catch us up after a long absence. So the last State of the Basin report came out in 2020, and a lot has changed. And as we go through this, there's some bad news, but there is some good news as well. So anyway, we'll look forward to presenting that. Um, uh, so we're going to be a little bit lighter on the sort of the technical hydrology side of the how the basin works as we have in the past, because we've got a lot to talk about of more recent doings and the current study results and trends and those kinds of things. So that's where really our focus is going to be tonight. And Rachel's going to kick it off in the beginning, and then I'll pick it up towards the end. So, Rachel?
All right, sounds good. Just to give you a quick outline of today's presentation. So first, we'll just go into a little bit of the background of who at Roux is involved in this project, what is our field site area, as well as the main goals that we have when we're doing our field investigations out here. Then we'll go a little bit into the various spring and groundwater monitoring we do within the Amargosa watershed. And then I'll hand it over to Andy, who will go over some of our updated and preliminary results and findings, wrap up with a quick little summary, and then we'll open up for questions. So just so you know who at Roux is involved in this project, you have both myself and Andy. And then we have two other geologists at Roux who often come out and do field work in this area. Their names are Mary Grace and Ben. And all of us have been out to the Amargosa a number of times. And every time we go out there, we fall more and more in love with the area. It gets harder to leave every time I come out there. So really happy to be a part of this project. So this map shows the Amargosa watershed. I wanted to point out an important feature is that it spans across the Nevada and the California state boundary. So it's a really interesting watershed in that basin because Nevada and California obviously have different laws when it comes to how they look at groundwater. And they often don't talk to one another. So what's going on in Nevada is a little bit different than what's going on in California. What's going on in California is a little bit different in Nevada. And it can make decision management a little bit difficult because we're working across state boundaries here. The Amargosa watershed, a key feature inside of it is obviously going to be the Amargosa River, which its headwaters are up in Beatty, Nevada, which is going to be the northern part of this graph. And that is going to be in the Oasis Valley hydrographic basin. The river heads south through the Amargosa Desert hydrographic basin, and then into the middle Amargosa Valley groundwater basin. And then it's going to make a U-turn and head north into the Death Valley groundwater basin, where its terminal point is going to be in Badwater Basin, which is inside Death Valley National Park. Our primary focus is the middle Amargosa Valley groundwater basin, which is this area here. And specifically, we're looking at the wild and scenic designation portion of the Amargosa River. And that is going to be the light blue version. So this blue line is the river, and where it's in light blue, that is the wild and scenic portion of the Amargosa River. And a significant portion of that is in the Shoshone-Tacoma area. So our project goals for doing our work out here in the Amargosa are twofold. First and foremost, we want to be able to improve our understanding of the water sources that feed the Amargosa River, as well as the ecosystems around that river. And then we want to be able to identify and advert any potential impacts to those water sources to get an idea of making sure we are protecting the springs that are in this area because they're often the only source of water to a number of wildlife in the area. And for those of you that might be familiar with the Amargosa area, it has a high number of threatened and endangered species that all thrive around these spring ecosystems. In addition to that, a lot of the communities around the Amargosa River actually rely on spring water for their drinking water. So Beatty, Nevada gets a majority of its drinking water from springs, so does Shoshone. And then within Tecopa, a huge amount of its recreational money comes around from springs. So we want to be able to make sure we fully understand where is the water coming from and how do we make sure we protect it so we protect those ecosystems around the river. And in order to do that, we do a lot of field work when we're out there. The first thing that we're going to usually typically do is spring monitoring. So this map shows most of the springs that are within the Amargosa watershed area, especially within the boxes that we're looking here that are labeled A, B, C, and D. I do want to point out that every time Roux comes out and does the field work, we don't go to every single one of these locations. It changes based on, if we're going in the winter, if we're going in the fall, how accessible an area might be, what are our individual project goals. So we may not go to all of these springs every time we're visiting there, but we wanted to let you know the springs that we have gone to. We have gone to all of these at some point in time. I'm just going to zoom into the point B map so you can see all the springs that are within the Tecopa area. These springs are around, again, the wild and scenic portion of the Amargosa River. And you can just see that there are a lot of springs within Tecopa. And so making sure we monitor these springs to get a better understanding of where their water sources are and how trends at the springs potentially could change over time is really important for us to be able to do so we can understand the overall health of the groundwater within the basin. When we go out and do our spring monitoring, we fill out these forms, which I have called Roux Spring forms. This form is an example of a filled out form for Salt Creek Spring, which is going to be at the southern portion of the Amargosa River. It's actually on Salt Creek, which is a tributary into the Amargosa River. And so we're looking at the southern portion here before it heads and starts flowing north. And when we fill out the spring forms, the types of information we're looking for is location information. It is really important to make sure that we take notes on coordinates where the spring is located, as well as access notes on how you get to that spring, mainly because we want to be able to share this information with anyone who wants to use it for any type of water management decision. So they need to know where is the spring and how do they get to it. Does it involve a 5-mile hike? Can you just park next to the spring? Do you need a 4-wheel drive vehicle to get there? And so these are all things that we'll capture on our spring notes. So if someone wanted to go to the spring for any type of research purpose, they have a good record of how they can get there and the types of equipment that they might need. And so that is an important thing to capture on these spring forms. We'll also document spring information. So for those of you that may not know, there are a number of different spring types, and these are essentially just categories that various geologists have used to lump springs based on the conditions that they observe. These 3 springs that are shown on the right hand are just a few examples of different spring types that we might see. There are more than these 3, but these are just kind of 3 main examples that we might see. Rio Creek is the first one. That's going to be one of the most dominant springs that we see. And essentially, springs are groundwater that reach some type of confining layer. So either some type of fault that could be stopping groundwater flow, or the bedrock is not really good for flow, or a thick clay layer where the groundwater is going to hit that confining layer and move the groundwater up to the surface where it comes out as a spring. And for a reoccurring, it's going to form some type of spring brook, which is one of the dominant spring types we see in the Amargosa watershed. When we're looking at a limnocrene, that is where the groundwater is going to hit some type of layer that brings it up to the surface, and it's going to form some type of pool. Really good examples of limnocrene springs are going to be the springs that you see at Ash Meadows National Wildlife Refuge. And then a heliocrene spring type is, again, where groundwater hits some type of confining layer and then forms some type of wetland or marsh. A good example of where we see heliocrene is actually up north in Beatty. 7J Ranch, which is owned by the Nature Conservancy, has a really pretty heliocrene spring that's up there. It's just like a giant marsh wetland.
Can I pop in real quick?
Yeah.
There's a really good one on the hinterlands side of the Kingston Range called Kingston Spring, which has a really nice spring-fed pasture there.
Nice. But again, these are just 3 examples. There are different types of springs as well, and these are things that we'll capture on our form as well. Another thing that we'll document for spring information is flow, and this is really important to understand how the spring could potentially be changing over time, especially if you see a decrease in flow. And we document flow in the amount of gallons per minute that are coming out of the spring. Perfect example of not only are we recording flow, but we might also try to find historical records on flow. And a good example is Chapo Springs. So back in 1920, it was documented as having over 100 gallons per minute of flow at that spring. And the last time we were there, it was less than 10 gallons per minute. So over the past century, flow has significantly decreased, meaning that, something has impacted the water source that is feeding the spring. And so that is a huge indicator for us to figure out what could be potentially causing that impact. And so that's something that we will capture as well. And Andy will go a little bit over later in the results and findings on some of the springs that we have observed decrease flow since I've even started monitoring in 2021. And then another thing we'll capture is water quality. This is a photo of the instrument that we bring out to the field with us. It is called a Hanna multimeter. And essentially we're just going to drop it in the water and it's going to take records of pH, temperature, and a lot of other fancy parameters as well. Mainly, one thing we're thinking about when we're collecting water quality is a lot of the springs in the Amargosa watershed are regional, meaning they are fed by groundwater that is particularly old. So when we're taking water quality measurements, those water quality measurements should be the same over time that we come out and we observe the springs. And if we see any changes in water quality occurring at that spring, that means that there's something happening to whatever that original water source is, or maybe something that is happening at the spring that is impacting the water quality. So it's good to make sure that we have prolonged records over time, and we want to make sure that they're staying within a certain variation of one another. So just a good indicator of overall spring health, making sure those water quality parameters are stable. And then the last thing we're going to fill out is the types of plants and animals that we observe around the spring. And this is going to be animals that we observe both while we're there, as well as any tracks that they have left behind or any scat that they have left behind, which is a great indication of essentially who is coming to visit that spring. And the plants are a good indication of the overall health. These photos are photos that I have taken, as well as photos that I have taken from the Amargosa Conservancy's website as well. The top left photo is a photo of the Amargosa vole, which I personally have not seen one, but we know that they thrive around Borehole, Dodge City Spring, as well as Shoshone Spring. And for those of you that don't know, the Amargosa vole is one of the most endangered mammals in North America, and 90% of its population, it might even be more than that, now lives around Borehole Spring, so one spring within the Amargosa Basin. The photo on the top left is a photo of the red spotted toad. We saw this one at Crystal Spring, which is up in the Kingstons. And then the bottom left photo is niterwort, which is an endangered plant within the Amargosa watershed. It primarily is in the Carson Slough, which is around the Ash Meadows National Wildlife refuge. But Dr. Naomi Fraga has also found populations of niterwort sprinkled throughout Tecopa, which is really exciting to know that it is starting to grow. We're starting to observe it in other locations besides Carson Slough. And then the bottom right is screwbean mesquite, which is a photo that I took out at 12 Mile Spring. And it was really exciting for me to see this because screwbean mesquite is a type of mesquite that is dying pretty much throughout all of the Amargosa watershed. So it was particularly exciting to see a healthy tree at one of our spring locations. I think it was the first time I had ever seen a live screwbean mesquite, so it was very exciting for me. In addition to spring monitoring, we also do ground monitoring throughout the our portion of the field site, which again is around the Middle Amargosa Valley groundwater basin. We have 8 groundwater monitoring wells that we monitor. And when we go to these wells, we both use essentially a water level meter, which you can think as a really fancy measuring tape that you drop in a well, and when it hits water, it makes this really obnoxious beeping sound. And that's when you know you've hit water and you can measure how deep the water is beneath the ground surface. In addition to our hand measurements, we download data loggers. So we have data loggers in 7 of our 8 wells. And these data loggers are really great because they're going to collect depth to water measurements for us twice a day, 5 a.m. in the morning and 5 p.m. And having this record means we have a more refined understanding of how groundwater levels change over time. And we can see interesting features in them. When was the Ridgecrest earthquake, Andy? Was that in 2019?
Yeah, I think so. Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
so when the Ridgecrest earthquake happened in 2019 and we exported our data logger information in 2020, we could actually see the Ridgequake earthquake in there because the groundwater levels temporarily increased after that event. So it's fun to see little things, little features in there. But again, the data loggers are just great because they're able to capture a lot more information than we can actually capture because they're collecting data for us twice a day. And so when we go out there, we export that data as well. And the life of the data loggers are typically about 9 years. So they last for about 9 years before you have to go out and replace them, which is pretty fantastic. And then in addition to doing our groundwater and spring monitoring in the area, we're also just doing general field observations. What may have changed since the last time we're out there that could be an indication that something might be going on. A perfect example of this is Salt Creek Spring. And so before 2023, this second photo on the right here is a photo of Salt Creek Spring, and this is what it looked like prior to 2023. It's just a small portion of it. You can see there's a giant tamarisk on the left side of the photo, and the river is pretty wide. But in 2023, there was a lot of monsoons and a hurricane came through this area and it pretty much wiped out all of the Phragmites that grow within Salt Creek, ripped out this tamarisk tree. It's not present anymore. None of the mesquite are really present. And that area looks very different than it did before 2023. And so there are just things like that what we're documenting because unfortunately now Salt Creek Spring is being inundated by a bunch of juvenile tamarisks. So before where there were tamarisks, there wasn't that many. Now there are probably hundreds of thousands, if not millions, of juvenile tamarisks that are growing within Salt Creek Spring. And so that habitat has significantly changed. So we're just making general observations, as well as there's a couple locations along the Amargosa River that are above ground year round. One of them is at Dumont Dunes, and the other one that we go to is at the end of Cowboy Canyon. And so when we go to those portions of the Amargosa River, we're measuring flow of the river and water quality as well. So those are just some additional documentation that we take while we're out there. And with that, I'm going to hand it over to Andy to go over some of our preliminary findings and results.
Yeah. So we just released the latest and greatest version of the State of the Basin report. There is a lot there to wrap your head around, to dive into. You won't get it through an evening, sitting in front of the fire. It'll take, a little while. It's a monster report, 64 pages of text, lots of tables and figures. Of interest, normally a lot of times appendices are sort of extraneous information and the data and things like that that you may want to peek at if you really have a specific need. In this case, though, you probably want to peruse the appendices as well. So I'll kind of outline what's in there because it's jam-packed with information. The first appendix is what we call the catalog of springs, and this has been a feature of each of the State of the Basin reports. Essentially, there's a folder for each of the springs that are out there. Every one of those dots that Rachel showed on those maps has its own spring folder, and in that spring folder, there'll be subfolders with our field data sheets. There are these forms called proper functioning condition forms that we fill out. There are photographs and video of the springs. There will be water rights information about springs, and any other kinds of information. Back in 2015 and 16, we did file searches from both the Barstow and Needles offices and got all their scanned all of their spring files, and all that information is in there in those folders. So there's a lot to look at in the catalog of springs. This Appendix B is a memo Roux prepared on behalf of Inyo County about 3 years ago, and it's our review of the Death Valley 3 groundwater flow model that the USGS developed. And that was submitted to the Nevada State engineer at that time when there was a request for comments on the model. And so that memo is there, so you can look at that. Appendix C is basically a climate change report for the Shoshone-Tacoma area. There's a website called CalAdapt, and in CalAdapt, you can actually plug in a location or even a zip code, and it'll give you like a 40-year climate snapshot for that location. Changes, and you can kind of customize it for your own needs, but it'll be like changes in temperature, anticipated changes in precipitation, those things. So the CalAdapt report's in there. It's kind of, the results are summarized in the State of the Basin report, but the actual report's there for you if you want to look at that. Appendix D and E are California and Nevada water rights summaries and documentation, respectively. So if there's things you want to dive into, there's that. And again, the State of the Basin report has discussions on the results of those searches and changes and things like that. In Appendix F, we have well data, essentially. Appendix G is a series of cross sections that have been a feature of each of the State of the Basin reports since 2014. And those years ago, I drew a series of cross sections that start up near the Nature Conservancy's properties up by Beatty and are continuous all the way down through Oasis Valley, Amargosa Desert, down along from Death Valley Junction to Shoshone and along the Wild and Scenic River to Dumont Dunes Road. So it's a number of pages because it's a long thing, but it does kind of point out some things that are good to wrap your head around when you're trying to understand what the story is of the river. So there's those cross sections. Appendix H has graphs showing changes in spring flow and water quality parameters over time. These are really, really useful. When we first started doing this work back around 2009, places like Tom Spring, you could drive up to Tom Spring and you could hear the water flowing from the spring from your car. And it'd be maybe flowing at 15 gallons per minute. And the last That's about 2.5 years, 2 years. It's been surface flow has been absent from that spring. And you can kind of watch different changes. And there's some things like the borehole, we're seeing some changes, which I'll get into. But anyway, you can look at those trends over time. Appendix I has a series of well hydrographs, which I'll be showing you some of those, which show changes in water level over time. Appendix J is another Roux memo that was prepared to look at potential changes in water rights applications in the Oasis Valley and far northeastern Amargosa Desert, sort of right on the border of those two hydrographic basins. So you might want to peruse that. That has some interesting information, particularly as it relates to potential future mining up in the Beatty area and effects on water levels in that area. Appendix K is a copy of our Ash Meadows hydrologic technical memo that was commissioned by the Nature Conservancy. And this was when the proposed lithium mining by Ash Meadows was kind of at the height of concern. And so we did that analysis of that using the Death Valley 3 model to run some scenarios of what a future dewatering might look like. And so that's definitely something, if you haven't read it already, you probably would want to peruse. And then when we first started doing these things, the last Appendix L, which is a references appendix, was essentially all those non-copyright concerned references that are referenced in the report are in that folder. So you don't have to go searching for it. If you see something that we say and there's a reference to it, if you want to find the reference, chances are you can just go into Appendix L and find a PDF of that document and read it. You don't have to go on a wild goose chase online to find some of these things. And especially, the last couple of years, things that I used to be able to find online all the time are sort of disappearing offline. And so it can be harder to find things than it used to be. So anyway, that's what makes up the State of the Basin report. Next. So changes in spring trends. I almost want to put something over this so you can't read ahead here, because I want to tell a little bit more about, maybe go back. And then I'll talk about, I want to talk about Chapo Spring a little bit, because there's some real lessons to be learned from Chapo Spring. So back, it was in 2009 when we were going to get this work started. I was at with Bill Christian from the Nature Conservancy, and I think John Hyatt was there. It was a desert managers meeting at the USGS offices in Henderson. And one of the things as we're getting started, it was just kind of a puzzler. People we were talking about, including myself, was that it was kind of strange that with all the pumping that had occurred in the 60s and 70s in Pahrump Valley, that it didn't seem like that there had been a lot of effect on the springs in the Middle Amargosa Basin. And that was kind of a curious thing. Well, fast forward, and we're putting together a State of the Basin report, and I'm kind of a history nerd when it comes to these areas, and I collect old reports and things. And I have in my library here a copy of there's a USGS geologist named David Thompson who did reconnaissance studies in the area in the late 19 teens and early 20s. And in he did two reports, and in both of them they mentioned this spring called Yeoman Hot Spring. And it was a real puzzler, because Yeoman Spring, it was reported as being flowing at over 100 gallons a minute, but there's nothing called Yeoman Hot Spring these days out there. And it's like, what is this spring? And I mean, it was being talked about in the same breath as Shoshone Spring and Resting Spring. And even fast forward in 1964, the Department of Water Resources had a California groundwater report where they even, again, the 5 things they reference are Shoshone Spring, Tacoma Hot Springs, actually five springs. Shoshone, Tacoma Hot Springs, Willow Creek, Resting Spring, and Yeoman, and then they call it Warm Spring. And that put it into some pretty heady company. So I was really kind of trying to puzzle out where Yeoman Hot Spring is, what the heck that was. And I started getting some ideas it might be Chapo. And I talked to Judy Palmer, who does a lot of historical research in the area, and she had noticed that too and came to that same conclusion. And what that told us, because when we go out there, it was only flowing 2 or 3 gallons a minute. What it told us was in these huge basins, change happens slowly. And you can't think of things, and you'll see this in the trends where, we kind of get excited by 1/10 of a foot type intervals, one way or another. And what it tells you is that change happens really slowly. And when you've got a spring flowing 100 gallons a minute, if you lose 1% of the flow, a gallon a minute, visually, if you're not actually doing detailed monitoring, you'll never see it. It'll look the same to you. And it happens so slowly that even if it's going year to year to year, you're getting used to seeing it as it is, and you're still not seeing it. And then people leave and move, and somebody else comes in, and that whole process starts together. And if you're not monitoring it, before you know it, you've lost over 90% of the flow and nobody noticed. And, you've got to think about change in these springs in the terms of generational change as opposed to year. And the same goes for recovery, because there's a lag effect of when pumping ceases or decreases. Recovery will start happening where that pumping occurred pretty rapidly, but it does so by extending the cone of depression of depressed groundwater levels further and further out for a period of time, and before it starts recovering altogether. And we seem to be at an inflection point in this, and so we'll get into that now. Okay, go to the next. So changes and spring trends. We've had some recently dry springs that have no surface water, but did when we started monitoring. Schofield Spring, which is up in the southern Nopah range, when we first identified it and then monitored it for a period of time, it was always it's a small amount of flow. The amount of vegetation and the variety of vegetation there belies the relatively small flow it is. But in the last 2 monitoring events, there has not been any surface water there. And based on some of the geochemical work we did, I think that's water leaking from California Valley through the mountains. And so that may be a result of the declining water levels that we saw in California Valley, although hopefully that will be changing. Then there's some springs that have had a little bit more complex. Red Trail is actually a seep right across the highway from in Shoshone, right across the highway from the campground. 12 Mile Spring in Chicago Valley, which I have new optimism about. So we'll talk about that. And Wild Horse Spring, which usually, it never had a lot of water, but it was you usually could find wet ground, and for a while BLM did some work out there, and you could see flow a little bit more easily, but the last 1 or 2 times we've been out there haven't been able to find surface water present, at least that we could measure. The borehole, we have a hydrograph from the USGS website. In the report, it seems to be in a slowly decreasing trend. And as you see down below, there's also an interesting trending decrease in our total dissolved solids measurements in that. So it's becoming a little fresher. And so I think it's also becoming a little cooler too from when we really initially measured it. So there's that. On the other end of the realm, we have more increased flow at salt, but I think that's more a result of a lot of, in those flash floods, a lot of the overburden that was in the canyon bottom got washed away. And so now, basically, what you're seeing is really shallow bedrock there. So the flow you're seeing now, it's at the surface, but at that time, it was still flowing through there, but it was just in the sands that were in the canyon bottom that are now gone. So you do see there's more surface water present at salt than we used to see. Same thing, Rachel hit upon the big habitat change at Salt Creek too, with all the tamarisk coming in. That had been a big success story on tamarisk mitigation back in the day, but now it looks like it's coming in full charge ahead. So that's going to be something we need to watch. Some of these springs too, they get difficult to measure for a couple reasons, variety of reasons. But anyway, sometimes things you just can't get to them. They come out overgrown, or and sometimes there's weed grows that we don't want to be hanging around, things like that. And in the last monitoring event, Patrick Donnelly was out hiking and came across another really cool spring out in the Ibex Hills. And so we're adding that to our cadre of springs. Yeah, always finding new things out there. Next. So one of the things we put these water ages in here is because as we go in and we see some changes and I've been asked this several times, because as you'll see, a couple of our trends in certain areas are actually starting to go upward, which is a very nice thing. It's been a depressing thing to watch water levels drop and springs dry up for 15 years, and now to see maybe things starting to recover in a couple places is really encouraging. But I've been asked about, the effects of recent storms, but I put these ages in here to really just highlight a lot of these things that we're going to be talking about are regional features, have regional flow, and they're going to be less affected by, recent flooding and things. So I think what we're seeing here, what we're going to be pointing out is more regional change. Next. So go look at groundwater trends. So the first one we're going to look at is our ARHS 8, which was put in under a grant from the California Department of Water Resources, which was installed in 2018. And it's about 200 feet deep. It's at the old former Evelyn Railroad siding site north of about 8 miles or 9 miles north of Shoshone. If you're driving on 127, it's where that one Athel tree is, which Brian Brown calls the Amargosa National Forest. So, and we have a well there, and it's been showing a very small, without the transducers, we probably wouldn't really be seeing it, but a really small trend of downward water levels. And it's really, it's like 0.04 feet per year. It's like maybe a quarter of an inch or even, less than that, or maybe a quarter inch per year. But it's been consistent. Now, the next one over to the right is our ARHS1, which was our very first monitoring well that we installed north of Shoshone. It's about 4.5 miles north of Shoshone. And that was actually doing the same trend as what we see at Evelyn. And that was doing that since that well was installed in, I believe, 2012. And that trend had been consistent up until about 2022. And things have started to stabilize there. And I think our last water level measurement, which we just took in mid-January, our hand level measurement was like only a hundredth of a foot off of what our measurement was in 2021 or 2022. So really, I mean, it is flat as a pancake for the last 3 or 4 years, which is a very good thing. So that was sort of one of our first things, very subtle, but it's kind of changed. And for those of you who don't know the story of ARHS1, it was a really auspicious start to studying the system out there. It is immediately adjacent to the Amargosa River channel, and we were looking out at that spot in particular because that place had bugged me for years driving by there, either after climbing a peak somewhere out there or just driving through for work or whatever. There's always that idea of the water's flowing right beneath the channel's surface, all of that. But driving by there, the plants were wrong for that. Where was the arrowweed? Where are those plants showing up? And they're just not out there. So I wanted to see what's going on with the river. So we put in that well, and we ended up, I mean, again, this is right next to the well, I mean, to the river, rather disconcerting. We drilled through like 50 feet plus or minus of dry river gravels. And then we drilled into Tacoma lake bed deposits, those clayey deposits that you see around the basin. And we went through, and this was, really, we weren't prepared for what we had to do out there. So the driller's going through augers left and right, and we're not hitting water. And so we were approaching, he had brought out 100 feet of auger out there. And we get to 50, all these river gravels, and then we get into the clays, 50 feet in the clays, no water. We ran out of augers, so the driller had to drive back to Vegas, get some more augers, brought another 50 feet of auger out, and kept drilling, dry, got to 149 feet. We had 1 foot of auger left, and we hit water. And the water came up the casing about 50 or 60 feet, and it was 100-degree water. Completely not what we expected to encounter immediately adjacent to the river. There is a major geologic fault that runs through the area, and we're probably tapping into the water that's coming up from depth along that structure. So we've been tracking that, and that one had a little decline, but like I said, that is now stable, which is a really good thing. Next. ARHS5 is kind of weird. I mean, what we're seeing there, that trend, sort of don't believe it. That is a monitoring well immediately adjacent to the Amargosa River along the Dumont Dunes Road. And it is heavily influenced by what Amargosa River conditions are. So it has been dry when the river channel has been dry, and when its rivers, depending on what kind of flow you're getting in the river at that location, that'll tell you what the well's doing. So that one kind of jumps around. We don't have a transducer in that well because of that. Goes dry for extended periods of time sometimes. Next. China Ranch. That was one of the first wells we put in because we wanted to see what was going on along Willow Creek. Problem with the location of the well at China Ranch is there is a reservoir that is maintained at China Ranch, which then feeds the drip irrigation system for the dates. And that, even though it's up gradient of the reservoir, it's heavily influenced by reservoir operations. So getting trends on that, it's there. We take the measurements. We also monitor the discharge along Willow Creek at that location, which is probably more important. But anyway, it's another interesting point. And it is kind of supplemental to our Married Man's Camp ARHS4 monitoring well, which is up in the sort of headwaters of Willow Creek, which is, if you're going out east from Tacoma towards the Kingston Range, There's one little turn off there where the old, it was yet another Tacopa in this location, which is completely torn down. It was a little mining camp when the mill there was operating. Anaconda had a mill there. And we have a monitoring well there. And as long as that well has been in there, which since 2012, it's been stable with very little change. You might have some seasonal changes. That big hump you see in the water levels there is when the whole place flooded during the hurricane, and we had some big gully washer monsoons as well. So next. Now this is getting really interesting. ARHS3. So this is near, right at the location of 12 Mile Spring in Chicago Valley. 12 Mile Spring used to be a much larger spring than the one you see today. And you can actually look at some of the dry channels around there, and you can see at one point that spring water used to flow around the vegetation and come out onto the valley floor a bit. I've heard stories about back in the 50s and that time frame. People used to go out there and play in the water when it was hot and things like that. Back in the early 1900s, 1890s vintage, the actual main road through Chicago Valley went by 12 Mile Spring, and that's where wagons would fill up their barrels with water for the long hauls between the Amargosa Borax Works and borax operations to the north. Basically, the surface water at 12 Mile Spring consists now of about a 3-inch diameter puddle at the bottom of about a 1.5 foot deep hole that's choked with vegetation. That's it. Water levels trended. When we started, we put the monitoring well in around 2011, 12, and for the longest period, the water levels were dropping 1/4 foot per year. I mean, it was dropping, and we were watching it drop at the spring as well. A lot of vegetation that was around the spring died off. Used to have these incredible amounts of yerba manza around there, and a lot of that kind of died off there. The good news is that the last few years, it was interesting because that little puddle of water in the hole subsisted. And for a while it was absent. It did dry up for about 2 or 3 monitoring events, and then it started showing up again. And what we're seeing in the monitoring well, as you can see here, is that since 2021, the water level has actually increased about 1/2 foot. And that's enough to maintain a little bit of that water, and it is recovering. So this is the spring that is most connected to Pahrump Valley of all the springs we have. In fact, the water chemistry at the spring is precisely what you would see from a well in Pahrump Valley. And so I think what we're starting to see at 12 Mile Spring is when I talked about that lag in the recovery at distance from pumping centers, is we're starting to see finally some recovery from the heavy pumping that occurred in Pahrump Valley during the 1960s and 70s, where at times the pumping was at 2 or 3 times the recharge rate. So I think we're starting to see some of that recovery because pumping's now much less than it was back in that time frame. Same thing, interestingly enough, in California Valley. We've got a couple weird things that happened at our California Valley well, ARHS 10. We installed that in. Water level started dropping at 0.3 feet per year. I mean, you just go out from measurement to measurement, and it'd be another 1/10 of a foot, another 1/10 of a foot, another 1/10 of a foot, and then the Ridgecrest quake hit. And the water levels, something changed in the subsurface. I think probably cracks in the caliche layer, something like that. And we started getting recovery. And it started recovering as fast as we were seeing a downward trend before. And actually, Tule Spring actually had water overflowing its thing, which we hadn't seen since we started monitoring. And then about 2 months later, there was a little micro earthquake on the north side of the Kingston Range, And whatever was feeding that water closed up, and it's been dropping ever since, again, and Tule Spring dried up until this past year. And so we now have, since the ultimate low point back in the fall of 2024, we had a period of time where we didn't have any monitoring going on. To the last couple of monitoring events, we've had consecutive recovering of the water levels in California Valley to the tune of, I'm looking here, of pretty close to maybe like 3/4 of a foot, which is significant. So I have hopes for Tule Spring to get some water back in the future if this trend continues. And maybe in a couple hundred years, we'll start seeing water showing up at Schofield Spring again. Next. We have a well, if you're driving from Shoshone to Pahrump on the highway, right at the state line, we have a well on the north side in Stewart Valley. That well has been declining about 1/4 of a foot per year, and that is continuing to decline over that time. Right now, I mean, the graph's only showing since 2021, but I can tell you that trend has been exactly the same since we installed the well in 2018. Next. So another piece of the work we're doing, we have a modeler that we work with named Walt McNabb, amazing guy, former Lawrence Berkeley lab modeler. And he's working on the DV3 model and updating it. The original DV3 model didn't consider the monitoring wells we have installed up there as calibration points. And some of the water level measurements predicted by the model were way off from what we actually see in the wells. So we're cleaning some of that up and actually making a little bit more detail. So some of the, to use it is very complex. And you really had to tinker around with, identifying what effects on springs. So we're kind of making a little bit of changes on how springs are presented. And actually each are identified as separate reaches, so we can identify, what's happening at different springs. So that's a work in progress. Next. So we're going to go here. So when we go through, look at all the results and what we're doing, and you see it year after year after year, there's always more that needs to be done. In fact, what I kind of analogize this to be is sort of like when the first monitoring wells were we had a lot of misconceptions about what was going on in the basin. And so a little bit of this was like going to the dentist. We're kind of cleaning out some of the plaque of bad information and getting our teeth in good order here. And with each monitoring well, we've learned something new, and it's actually pointed out something else we don't know and we need to look at. But it all points out to the really need to keep maintaining this, an effective monitoring program out there. This grant is going to keep us going and monitoring till the first half of 2028. And that's great. But then we've got to be thinking about post 2028 and the long run. Because as I mentioned earlier, when we're talking about Chapo, these changes happen generationally, and the only way you're going to see that is continuing to monitor these things. Best management practices for water management, and looking at the very minimum, when projects are being proposed, looking at the Desert Renewable Energy Conservation Plan, sort of BMPs for investigations and evaluations of projects. I mean, that should be baseline at the minimum, usually needing more, but it's not going less than that. Tamarisk, right now there are efforts to look at, the tamarisk in the Amargosa River Canyon. We've got another big problem showing up on Salt Creek, and that's going to need to be looked at. New groundwater monitoring wells. We have a pretty good network right now of across the basin, but they're all shallow. And there is some real puzzling things going on near the triple junction of Chicago Valley, Stewart Valley, and northwestern Pahrump Valley. And it looks like groundwater flow sort of splits into two, with some of that water going off to Chicago Valley and some of it continuing on towards Stewart Valley. And whether I think probably the Stewart Valley is more portion is more shallow, and maybe what's coming into through Chicago is deeper. But that's a wild guess. But I think what the USGS installed deep well in Chicago Valley. It takes 3 points to define a plane and to get a gradient. And so we really could use 2 more deep wells to go along with that. The problem is deep wells are expensive. And so, an effort to that kind of effort would be well north of $1 million, probably closer to 2 to 2.5 to do 2 wells. So that kind of funding doesn't come across the table very often. So going to keep being on the lookout for additional grants on new groundwater monitoring wells. There's probably other places that would be helpful to have deep wells, especially adjacent to our existing wells. But right now, I think Chicago Valley would be a key place for that. Be interesting to get some new precipitation stations that span the ranges of elevations in the basin, so we can see how rainfall or snow increases with elevation and get a handle on those kind of relationships. Back 12 years ago, as part of the analysis for the drinking water structure out at Tacoma Heights, we managed to squeak in there an estimate of estimating recharge from the Kingston Range. That could have been greatly enhanced by having a really good rain gauge up there somewhere around Horse Thief Spring or something like that. So some stations would be really helpful out there, and should be another consideration. It's been in multiple proposals and things over the years, and we still need those. Whenever we're finding new wells, putting in new wells or doing spring monitoring and find a new seep spring, that always entails getting a suite of general chemistry and isotopic analysis on those. So that's going to needs to continue. Geophysical investigation. So there is a structure that extends along Highway 127, basically almost from Tacoma, goes up past Shoshone and all the way up along the sort of the valley, along the western base of the Resting Spring Range. In Jeremy Workman's geologic map, he has that called part of the Ash Meadows Fault. And if you kind of put a ruler on your paper map, which I like to use, and extend it up, it sort of runs smack dab into the gravity fault up by Ash Meadows. And the problem up there is, we put in ARHS1 and then the Evelyn well, because at those locations, primarily because it was the only places we could, because there's wilderness boundaries that come all the way down to the highway on both sides of the highway at that point, and you can't get in there to put additional wells. I suspect that fault will extend through the saddle directly between Eagle Mountain and the Resting Spring Range up into the Ash Meadows area. It would be really nice, since we can't access it for putting in wells, to do some geophysics out there and see if that sheds some light on what's going on structurally out there. So interestingly enough, when we put in that Evelyn well, I told the story of ARHS1 and the 100-degree water. when we put in the Evelyn well, initially when we first hit water, it was cool, but when we were pumping it to develop the well, we started drawing in warm water, and we were watching the temperature just continue to rise throughout the well development. So whatever that feature is that was feeding ARHS1, we're in close proximity to it at Evelyn as well. And it would be, those geophysics would be really helpful. And then, refining the DV3 model, models are no model is designed to be a static thing to last 50 years. Our understanding only comes with the information that we know now, and there's always new data being collected and new things found, and that enhances our knowledge, and things can change. And so how we, the groundwater model is a simulation of actual on-the-ground conditions. As your understanding of those on-the-ground conditions changes, the models need to change with them. So there are some things that can be refined now. We're working on one part of the model, but it's a small part of a much larger feature. So the rest of the model can need some refining as well. So those are all recommendations in the report. So overall, we've got groundwater in some areas is starting to stabilize. Woohoo! And however, groundwater in other areas continues to decline. So you can't win them all. Thule Spring, Tom Spring, and Schofield Spring are dry. I kind of think if the recovery is kind of irregular where it's happening. If I had to pick the next spring that's in the line to go dry, it's probably Chapo. But with the stabilizing water levels at 12 Mile Spring, I'm reasonably feeling good that may not happen. Certainly, we need to keep monitoring and for the long term. Same with the analyses. As we get more information, we got to adapt to the new information and tell us, what are we getting wrong? What are we getting right? The way we approach these things is, once we have our picture of what is going on, the next step is to figure out the data we need to prove that we're wrong. And so that's science. And so, that's the next thing we need to collect is, okay, if we're wrong, what would be the thing we need to look at to prove we're wrong, and we need to adapt, or change our way of looking at things. So that's what we're constantly evaluating and analyzing. Next.
Sorry, here we go.
So special thanks to over the years, all the groups that have helped make all this work happen. And some names that you probably haven't thought of, like Transition Habitat Conservancy, and we include them in because there was a period in 2015 to 16 where we did a California desert-wide spring survey, and they took it on to manage that project and contributed a lot to that project financially as well, providing trucks and all of that, and staff to help out. And so, they've contributed to this. They're down in the Victorville area. Nature Conservancy, all the groups you see here have all contributed to all the information we have here. And also the Wildlife Conservation Board in particular, and we're working under the current grant from them. And then we actually did a lot of work under a grant from the California Department of Water Resources back in 2018. So they're acknowledged as well. And I think with that, oh, by the way, that location you're seeing in the picture there is China Ranch Canyon above China Ranch. It's, along Willow Creek. It's at a point that's called Thelma and Louise Point. And when you drive up to it, you'll understand why. So anyway, with that, I guess it's open to questions.
Feel free to drop any questions you have in the chat or unmute or whatever you're comfortable with.
Looks like there's one in the chat.
Yeah. So Jim Lane says, is Pahrump primarily dependent on groundwater pumping? And if so, will continued development affect spring levels in the Amargosa Valley? It's not like we're getting additional snowpack in the spring mountains to offset any additional drawdown.
So, yeah, the water's coming from pumped groundwater, to answer that question. So whenever you pump water from a basin, it comes from something else. So any water that is pumped is going to come at the expense of water flowing out of the basin, like towards California Valley or towards Stewart Valley and Ash Meadows or somewhere, or springs, water flowing under the Nopah Range towards 12 Mile Spring. All water comes from at the expense of something else. So the good news is that water pumping has decreased considerably since the really high glory days of pumping in the 60s and 70s, when pumping got over 50,000 acre feet a year. We're in a fraction of that now. But, again, things are also getting warmer. There's some new information that I'm still wrapping my head around. There's an analysis that I'm kind of just came across my desk, and a look at temperatures and decreasing recharge as a result over time. And it's kind of paints a bleak picture. So in answer to your question, 12 Mile Spring, as a result of that pumping, probably will never come back to what it was back in 1900. But if it may come back a little bit to, be maybe something along the lines, in our lifetimes anyway, of, or maybe some of you online that are younger than me, your lifetimes as opposed to mine, will be, coming back to what we were seeing back when we first started monitoring it, which would be a wonderful thing. So there's that.
Awesome. We have another question. Where can we access the State of the Basin report? Where is it available for public consumption to read, peruse, all that?
Is that going to be on the Amargosa Conservancy? The last one was on the Amargosa Conservancy website.
Yeah, we'll get it up there. We're waiting for it to cool off the hot press, Andy, and then we'll get it uploaded.
Okay, awesome.
Is it melting? Is it melting in your hands? It's so hot.
Exactly right.
Okay, another question. Do you work with Spring Stewardship Institute and Flagstaff for achieving spring data?
We haven't been working on them. I mean, we've been really kind of focused on the California area, and they're kind of more focused in Southern Nevada and Arizona and things like that. So it really hasn't. But we do make all of our work public. BLM. I mean, it's really nice having the links, because back in the days of 2014, when I was putting this out, I would spend 2 weeks doing nothing but stuffing envelopes with thumb drives, sending them all over to get this stuff out. So, and that was a real pain, because then I'd find myself sending the same group 7 thumb drives because they kept getting lost. So it's nice having these online downloads here now. So it's totally open to the public. Everybody can download it. Other databases can access it. If anybody wants our data, they can download it. It's all there.
And I can't remember the name of the individual who runs the Spring Stewardship Institute, but I met him at a conference. He actually talked about springs. And those spring type photos that we showed are drawings from SSI, from Spring Steward Institute. I did give him my business card if he wanted to upload or share information, but I have not heard back from him yet.
Cool. Okay, another question. The amount of vegetation, mostly mesquite, in Willow Creek Canyon has noticeably increased during the last 20 years. Do you expect this to decrease the flow at China Ranch?
Can you repeat that again?
The amount of vegetation, mostly mesquite, in Willow Creek Canyon has noticeably increased during the last 20 years. Do you expect this to decrease the flow at China Ranch?
Well, yeah, I mean, I don't know how. It's kind of interesting because there was the fire at China Ranch,
Yeah.
and um, we haven't really seen a big wild difference. It just seems very kind of stable right now, and I think it's all there's the plants that are there, and they may increase as well. Um, what I would expect is as temperatures get warmer, we're going to have longer growing seasons. And so the period of uptake of those plants in particular is going to extend to longer periods. They unlike this, streams in the Owens Valley where you get the spring runoff, here you have an inverse thing because you get the big flows when all the plants go dormant in the winter time, in late fall and in the winter time. And but the longer the growing season is, the more the more that water is going to get used, and there could be a decrease in spring flow. I don't know if it'll affect their results because actually Bryan's is not actually fully capturing all the flow there. So I don't, there's still some that are sort of bypassing there. But anyway, it certainly could. That does raise an interesting question, though. That question raises another question which wasn't answered, but I'll answer it anyway. and that is, as much as we get concerned about regional pumping and effects on these big springs, which is definitely a concern, I'm equally, and sometimes even, and actually after this new data that I'm looking at that was generated from BLM in California here, and looking at recharge rates and temperatures and things like that, I'm actually as much or even more concerned about the effects of climate change on the small local perch springs in the ranges that are really important to wildlife and sort of intermediate locations for watering in between getting to the big springs. And the longer you have, the more first of all, the warmer it gets, the greater the evaporation and the less water gets to recharge, which in a local spring is a really big deal. And then you also have just a longer period of evaporation or transpiration going on those springs. Those are going to get, a lot of those are pretty meager springs, and there's not much to lose. And you lose a little bit, and it's gone. And, there may be the plants, the habitat may be there, but the surface water for sustenance may be gone. So that's one of the things I'm very concerned about.
Cool. How do you determine the age of fossil water?
Carbon dated.
Straight to the point.
Yeah, basically you can do the same thing. There's inorganic carbon. Think of CO2, type of thing, in water, and it decays over time. It's got a half-life of around 5,700 years. We send water samples to the lab, and what it'll come back as is like, I'll just throw it out because it's simple. 50% modern carbon is what the analysis will show, and that's 50% a half-life. So now there's some things that there are some corrections that need to go into that, but it's really simple as that. And I should add that whenever we do that sampling, we also throw in a constituent called tritium, and tritium kind of gives us a handle on if it's recent water or post 1952 water. And that's because that tritium is a result of the hydrogen bomb testing above ground back in the early 50s. And so, you can do some fancy isotopic work and really nail it down to, periods of a few years of what you're looking at. We're not really interested in that. We're more interested in, is it ancient or is it recent? Or is it a mixture of the two? And what the way you figure that out is you have 10,000-year-old water showing up in your sample, but you also got tritium. Well, that tells you that there's new water. There's probably two sources to the spring. You got deep water coming in from someplace, which is older, and you're also being affected by recent water, and they're mixing together. And basically, the age you got through the carbon dating is a weighted average of the two waters. And so that younger water is causing the older water to look younger than it is because it's mixing. And so, the older water is at least 10,000 years old. And then you got some young water come in, but you don't know the ratio of the two, and you need to do additional work to figure that out.
Very interesting. Cool. Have you noticed any notable trends in salinity or other water quality parameters that might affect conservation from fresh potable water? Conversion, reading.
So what was that again? Can you read that again?
Yeah, because I was struggling with reading. I was like, huh? Okay. Have you noticed any notable trends in salinity or other water quality parameters that might affect conversion from fresh potable water or to fresh potable water, maybe?
Well, we don't see much potable water in the Shoshone area. Shoshone Spring is very stable, so that's not changing.
Okay.
And they do water treatment there as well. So I guess, we don't see any changes happening out, there. I guess the closest springs, what do you think, Rachel? Amargosa Canyon? Think that would be probably the closest springs to Tacoma Heights area?
That would be changing to like a potable source.
Yeah, I mean, it's not a source of water that anybody uses, but if it's, as a signal for what might be happening. But
Yeah, and that spring historically was used for
oh, that's true.
yeah, because it was the site of the first gold mine in San Bernardino County. So there was a bunch of people that lived around there when it was an operating gold mine. But no, I mean, as Andy,
No, I'm sorry, not that Amargosa, not the one by Salt Creek. I mean,
the one in the canyon.
Yeah, like sawgrass and all that.
I don't know. That's a good question.
But yeah, I mean, I haven't seen anything that would cross that threshold. It's either bad or it's fresh and it's been staying there.
Yeah, and the reason we're seeing not many changes in salinity is because most of all these springs that we look at are regional, so they're all being fed by really old groundwater sources that aren't really being impacted. And so the salinity is pretty much staying the same. I will say that there has been slight changes in total dissolved solids, which could be an indication of salinity as well, and borax spring. So it's becoming a little less TDS, meaning it probably is interacting with the ground not as long as it used to be. So its source might be finally like diminishing a little bit, which is impacting the salinity. But it is so small right now that it will probably be years before we have any type of meaningful trend in that location.
And it is by far the worst water quality of anything we measure out there.
It's also like one of the oldest water locations we have in the basin too.
Close to 30,000 years.
Yeah.
I mean, this kind of tells you how, most of the water that you drink is either like calcium and bicarbonate or whatever. In that water, boron is so high that it's actually like a sulfate borate water. Yeah, of all the places, as bad as water can be at some of the hot springs and things, you really don't want to drink borax.
Cool. Has the flow rate diminished at Saratoga Springs in the southern part of Death Valley?
We're not monitoring that. It's in the
I didn't
park.
think so.
Yeah, we're monitoring things that are on BLM
Yeah.
areas and then selected private land. So we're not doing anything in the park at this point.
Cool. Any more questions? We have none queued up, but if you think of something, quickly type it out. We have a few more minutes here.
We do have the one transition we had was we used to monitor Owl Hole Spring out in the bowling alley area, but now that's in the park, so we don't go out there anymore.
When you were monitoring it, did it have a downward trend or was it stable?
It was a mess.
It was a mess.
It was
Okay.
it was borough
Okay.
it was borough central from the boroughs on Fort Irwin. They'd come down and it was you'd have to really watch where you step, and it was
Ooh.
the water smelled and it was never great. I mean, it was a mine site too, so I mean it was never great to begin with.
Mhm.
It was never potable water, but
Got it. Cool. Any theories as to why screwbean mesquite populations are decreasing?
I mean,
not from
there are
us.
not from us. People do have theories that you can find online published. One of them is a fungus that could be impacting the screwbean mesquite. Another is climate change could be impacting. And another, I think, is some beetle that could be eating like the bark as well. But the last time I checked, no one's really come up with a definitive answer as to why the screwbean mesquite populations are increasing, and what they're observing in the Amargosa watershed is being observed throughout the Southwest as a whole. I think a theory that I find interesting, also some folks think that it might be cyclical, that like screw bean populations just might have some die off like every X amount of years, and we might be observing that right now. But I think that is like a really big theory, which has not been proven, but I do find that one interesting.
Okay. Someone asked, did I hear you mention that there are near future mining developments in the Beatty area that could affect the headwaters of the Amargosa?
Yes, there's actually 7, as I think as we sit here today. I think there's 7 proposed open pit gold mines in the headwaters. The one that's kind of first in line is called the North Bullfrog Mine, and I think an EIS is going to be coming out here around April on that one. Sort of straddles the watershed boundary between Oasis Valley and Sarcobatus Flat, and that one's kind of concerning. I think one of the things, if you're interested in that the memo that's in Appendix J will be something you might want to read. One of the things that I brought up in that memo is with the amount of pumping that would be in there. Yes, there's the issue with drawdown and impacts to groundwater dependent ecosystems, and actually, town water supplies, things like that. But something that hasn't really been mentioned too much is, over time they've been monitoring a tritium plume on the test site, and it's been relatively stable. But if you have a big change to the hydrologic regime from uh, dewatering from all those operations, it's conceivable that you could remobilize that. And so that's going to be something that really needs to be considered as they look at plans for all these things as they come on consecutively over the years.
Yeah, someone asked about this video being available. We will be uploading it on our YouTube. soon after this. Mason, do you have a date goal of when we will upload this to the YouTube so that they'll know they can go back and review it? Mason.
I think a great goal would be tomorrow, and we can send it up with
Tomorrow.
the follow-up link from the Zoom webinar for everyone who registered and attended. So in very
Awesome.
short order.
Okay, then we will have it up tomorrow. And if something crazy happens and not, then the day after. So ASAP, send out a blast email. So you guys, if you came in late or you just want to re-listen to the amazing talks, feel free to. Any final questions before we wrap this up? Okay, well, it looks like that is the end of our webinar. Feel free to reach out to either Andy, Rachel with your questions, or me, any one of us at the Amargosa Conservancy. We'll send out an email with the link to this video. And if we have any further webinars in the future, I would love for you all to attend. This has been really great. Thank you so much, Rachel and Andy, for sharing all this information. And thank you to everyone who attended and stayed throughout this amazing talk. Have a wonderful night, y'all. Bye.
Thanks.
Bye.